So we're here with Ed Zyszkowski, CEO and Chairman of Personal Digital Spaces. We are kind of gearing up for the next Shaping CC's Future event on November 19th, and really are trying to highlight and focus and surface, much of the thinking and innovation that is underway through residents of the state or businesses of the state. And we were kind of connected with you and started to learn a bit about your background. And you're very humble, but your team was talking about all the things that you've been involved in.
That's a damn team.
But maybe just kind of bring us through, what Personal Digital Spaces is today and how you evolved into, kind of that vision.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Personal Digital Spaces really is a culmination of a lot of different influences over the course of my career and other founders' careers. So in today's world of AI, as most people are aware, but I'll reiterate it, we're having these very monolithic, hyperscalers, the usual suspects as Meta and Google, and of course new entrants like OpenAI, which is becoming massive as well. And in some ways they're building kind of a mainframe society where you have very specific silos of great power, great influence, and sure, they're doing fine. They're trillion-dollar companies, We are more into democratizing things, spreading things to the edges. And so philosophically, going back to my career, I've always been very much a decentralized, distributed, parallel processing person, and this represents a dovetailing of both the technology to enable that and the policies that will drive adoption in a broader way of new technologies by a larger base of people so that everyone benefits, not just a few really rich guys.
I mean, I love it. I think the idea of decentralization obviously it seems like that reached the forefront through crypto and those that sort of worry about
and
the
we
security.
have a blockchain component which helps facilitate that technologically. But crypto obviously deals with, again, spreading out the responsibility and the trust, or in this case, lack of trust, in such a broad way that you can have exchange of value between parties that don't know each other and still feel that there's an adequate representation of that value so that no one's getting
Do you think that we're on the precipice of that being sort of a more universally understood or accepted means of governance?
Decentralization or crypto?
Decentralization.
I mean, we are a decentralized society. Those societies where you have the ability for individuals to craft a story for themselves, a career for themselves, a life for themselves, and an economic value for themselves is, in fact, by its very nature. We as a country are a decentralized, country from a political perspective, an economic perspective. When there are bouts of, consolidation, this is go back to the age of the robber barons, where you consolidated a lot of power and value around railroads and early industrial development. Those created disparities, which ultimately exploded. I mean, I would say that the explosion of that disparity took a few decades, but the Depression was a direct consequence of that.
Yeah, I think the mass population struggle is even when that ultimately surfaces or manifests, there's a face to blame, and whether they are actually punished or not, or what
rarely does that happen,
right?
but if you look historically, I think that the movements in societies that really do well, we're talking before this podcast started about Poland. Poland's doing well because individuals in Poland finally feel that they have unleashed themselves from the stronghold of communist policies. And they're able to go ahead and do well as individuals. And I think that's creating incredible economic value. It doesn't hurt that the EU has provided a lot of cash as well.
Yeah, right.
But in this country, my concern right now is that we're going to, in some ways, the reverse direction, because such large capital amounts are being expended in interests of building these AGI systems, these hyper AI systems. And those capital flows really are keeping our economy afloat at the moment.
Right.
And should things change, that creates a lot of vulnerability. Ultimately, when you spread things around, no single points of failure. It really is decentralization is a fault-tolerant approach of anything, whether it's technology or economics or politics.
So your whole career has been advanced of the curve, right? There's early adoption, and then there's those that are creating what early adopters adopt, and that's where you've but that's where you focused. Probably hasn't all been playing.
Early on in my career, I wouldn't say I took a convention around. I did, like many other. I think I was fairly gifted as a kid, so I decided to be a physician. So I went to undergraduate school at Johns Hopkins and also to medical school with the idea of being a physician. And ultimately, I decided that was limiting because you're now sort of look, it's a great profession. I'm excited about it, but I wanted to do more, and so I wound up effectively becoming a scientist, building systems that had. We called it neuromorphic designs. There's an institute that came out of Johns Hopkins where I did my undergraduate and graduate degrees. They're called the Institute of Neuromorphic Engineering. And the idea is, can you learn from how the human brain is architected and build engineering systems? So that was my original start in the field. And I built early neural networks. Like, I hate to say this, dates how old I am, nearly 40 years ago.
But those were the sort of the early foundations for...
They really were, yeah. I mean, in fact, in my case, it was kind of almost an accident. I was interested in biology, so I was reading biology papers that talked about early experiments by McCulloch and Pitts. This was in the 1940s, where they were trying to model individual interneuron behavior. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting if we just built software that simulated that? And that was one of the first neural networks. In fact, I used backpropagation as a mechanism of dealing with, and this is getting a little bit wonky, but dealing with the gradient descent problem. And that worked out really well, and other people ran with it. In fact, Jeff Hinton, who recently won a Nobel Prize, built his career around that, and deep learning is based on that same technique.
And that was...
That was in the 80s when I did that, yeah.
And so, but people today know that as what? As natural language processing or machine learning?
Well, so this was, these were neural nets, which were simulations of simple nodes that capture a piece of information and are adjusted as that information as it goes through training. As you sort of process through multiple instantiations of some input data, and you try to compare that with the output data, you're essentially normalizing between the two, and you're adjusting these very thin. These were thin neural networks. They're single or two layer or three layer. The single layer ones were called perceptrons. Those were developed like in the 1950s at MIT. And others. But anyway, I took that. Literally, I was in a library. I was reading some papers that no computer scientist, no engineer would ever read. These were biology papers. Oh, well, let's try this out, and that's got me on that track. And then I used it. And one of the things that I think I worry about sometimes with academics is you tend to focus on that track and get really into the whole science of it. I also looked for practical applications, and it turned out I was working on a scanning transmission electron microscope, and we needed to develop a technology that helped us better align the underlying mechanism to create a single flow of atoms that were used to stimulate the objects that you were observing. And trying to do that alignment is really, really complicated and repetitious. I said, maybe I can use a neural network as part of that process. And that was probably one of the earliest uses, at least from an instrumentation and from a practical application perspective. And in the group that I was working with, Terry Sainowski, he actually built something called NetTalk, which was a human speech simulator. So he asked about NLP, and I got involved in that later on at a company called Thinking Machines. I was one of their senior scientists and ran their AI group for a while.
When you're working on these projects, whether it's 40 years ago, are you shocked at how far it has come today?
Am I shocked? No, I think it's a natural progression. I think the shocking part is the ability to build these massive systems that are able to. So the underlying algorithms that are being used are kind of a little bit brute force. And so, as you had different levels of computation, you're like, okay, great, we can do toy projects, we can do experiments with it, but so what? Only in the last decade or so have, and I do credit Jensen Huang and NVIDIA with building, these large parallel systems. The GPUs are really just large parallel computers that can do matrix operations. At such a scale, thanks to Moore's law and the large investment that went into it. Thank you, all you gamers, for supporting NVIDIA.
You got it.
I mean, there you go. That has resulted in technology that's enabling us to run these massively deep neural network systems. These are, in between the number of layers, this is something that would have been inconceivable. If you think about it, the amount of computation that, the connection machine, which is a massively parallel computer that we did, that, compare that to a single GPU card, it's a factor of trillions of difference. It's just amazing.
What do you think the next natural progression is going to be? What are you looking at for the next 40 years in, whether it's quantum computing or something
Next 40?
like that? Yeah. Maybe the next 20 with the way it's going. 4 or 5.
Yeah, I mean, even a decade, as you were doing with your conference in November. I think that there's a lot of different theories about that. People are talking about AGI or some ASI, which is artificial superintelligence. Whatever happens, it's going to be. What's happening now is on the cusp of profoundly changing how humans interact with other humans. If you listen to the rhetoric 20 years ago, when the internet was still just started bubbling up to be really a big thing, like the early days of Google. People were talking about, I think George Gilder wrote saying this is the biggest thing, it's going to change everything. And it did.
And then,
but
and
not
then others saying it
nearly.
was a fad and it was going to go away, right?
What's that?
And then others saying it was a fad and it was going to go away.
There were people saying that too. And in fact, there was a previous bubble, which was a telecom bubble of the early 2000s, which was a direct outcome of overbuilding the physical infrastructure. So from an AI perspective, I think it's going to profoundly change how people interact. And I think that's it's almost a great prompt to what I'm doing. I feel that if you leave that in the hands of a few, we're screwed. We as a society are screwed. Not just we as a U.S. society, we as a world society are screwed, because you'll wind up having these overwhelming, complex systems dictating a good part of how our lives are. Dystopian at some level. I think if you put these tools in the hands of individuals, almost like what happened, again, 40 years ago when the PC was first coming out, you started moving away. It's interesting, and this is just so off the wall, but by happenstance, I saw a snippet of a TV show that was running in the 1970s called The Rockford Files. It was a detective show, and they were talking about some evil group that was building this supercomputer in the 70s that was going to collect all the information from all the different government databases and use that to, influence individuals, mainly politicians, to do things. And go, well, that was 50 years ago.
Yeah, were they time travelers?
And, here we are. And so if you create these pools of massive power and don't allow other people to participate in that, it creates problems. If you push that out so that really, AI becomes a tool, yet another tool in our toolbox, just like a PC became another tool for small businesses, for individual creatives and so on, to be more effective, it could be a really great world. So I think we almost have this, dystopian, utopian direction. Where we're going to wind up being? Probably somewhere in the middle. Usually is what happens. And ultimately, we'll figure it out. Technologically, the other thing that's interesting is AI does allow us to magnify our capabilities. The folks at DeepMind I really think they're doing great with, for instance, the AlphaFold project, which helps determine protein folding. I worked with a guy in Harvard many years ago, Temple Smith, we literally thought we were going to change the world because we figured out how one protein folded under certain circumstances, and that took 3 years of computation. This is being done like all proteins. So the ability for us to understand biology at that level is going to change the way that we deal with healthcare, the way we deal with pharmaceutical industry and so on, quite profoundly as well.
And it seems like there's still to your point of evolutionary or exploratory phase, there are a core few that seem to really understand what it is that is now at their fingertips, and then there's a large group that isn't sure how to embrace, how to account for, how to utilize. We were talking to someone yesterday, and he was saying 2 years ago I was just wishing for 10 interns, and now I have 100, graduate level interns at my fingertips with ChatGPT and things like that. So,
and I think the operative word is interns, because just like interns, often mistakes are made. Things can be sometimes a little bit hallucinated.
Yeah, right. So from personal digital spaces, what type, are you focusing on a specific type of data or a specific?
Yeah, I think, it's like anything else, it's progressive. So personal digital spaces actually predates the whole AI, current iteration of generative AI. We were founded about 8 years ago. We moved to Connecticut as our headquarters about 5 years ago. And the original idea was, and I'll tell you the background. So many years ago, I sold my company. It gave me a little bit of a cash windfall. I have a family office to invest in projects. One of the projects, and I also was a partner in a private equity firm at the time, and we wound up buying one of the largest public safety software companies. There's a company that's been around for a while, but there's the 911 systems and also the record management systems for police and for fire, the 911 and so on. And so this company Tiburon, I wound up running it, and I wound up then doing the technology for it, and I wound up pulling out of the group and doing a separate project called Officer Guardian. And this was like in 2014, 2013, so it was a while ago. Over a decade ago. And the idea was, can you build a machine learning model of how a person, a police officer, for example, does his job over the course of time, and measure the physiological manifestations of them doing their job. So how they move, so how they walk, gait, things like body temperature, skin temperature, perspiration rate, heart rate. And so there was probably about depending upon which iteration of the technologies, either 9 or 12 different parameters, and those were inputs that were used to train very simple models, think of the AI models, and the output was, I'm okay. I don't know, do you ever see the show Silicon Valley, hot dog or not hot dog? Hot dog or not hot dog. I'm okay, I'm not okay. And basically that was the output. So it was not a very complex output, but it trained over a period of time, and the way it worked was, a police officer would put this physical device on, and it would train his model, and whenever things triggered, he would get a little notification saying, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah." And so he would it's supervised training. He would train it, but over a period of time. And these things were strikingly effective, not just at detecting whether somebody's in trouble, but also identifying what makes that person a person. So to the point where it could be used as an identification mechanism. So by wearing this thing, it would know that it's you, and it could act as a login for your laptop in your cruiser, or you could use it as a way to start your car. And so a bunch of police departments adopted it. But the issue was, this is very sensitive information because it's kind of quasi-health data. So we built a system for licensing that data. So the police officer ultimately controlled his data, not the police department and not the machine itself. And so that idea, kind of light bulb went off. Okay, so you're allowing individuals to control the data that's used to build a model that acts as a model to support that individual. And then, that company got sold, and we kept some of those ideas, and we built a product that said, not only can you control that data, but maybe you can actually sell it or share it with someone else. And this was early days of blockchain. Vitalik Buterin is a young man who's starting a project called Ethereum. He's he was a cousin of an acquaintance of mine, and we got working, and we wound up actually hiring a bunch of people from the original Ethereum project to use the blockchain as a conveyance of those rights, and also as a way of setting pricing and using a marketplace economy. So if you had rights to some data that you generated, you can, your data exhaust, you could potentially sell it. And so the company kind of started doing that. We wound up doing a bunch of things in the healthcare space where we allowed hospitals to provide health data to other hospitals and have it licensed and properly dealt with HIPAA stuff. And we did some things with refugee health management. And then as AI started happening in a bigger way, where content people felt threatened, that their content was being pulled into AI models through illicit scraping or whatever, we became really a way of creating the container, the gate, to keep that data from being improperly utilized. And so PDS, our big customer base are the book publishers, the music labels, film companies, a lot of other companies that basically have proprietary data that they want to protect. That was sort of phase one. And probably over the last 18 months or so we don't just want to protect it, we want to make money. And so we're really driving the ability for individual companies to do an AI transformation at a much more cost-effective level than either surrendering their data to one of the large model companies or trying to build their own model. To try to build, obviously, billion-dollar companies that build proprietary enterprise models. It's still expensive to do. And the secret sauce we have is we build small models that represent single data assets. Just like with this original Officer Guardian, where it was a really small model, it ran on a mobile device.
Right.
That could represent that individual's, sort of physiological profile. In this case, we call them SAMs, single asset models. You have a model that represents a single asset. Think of it as a single SKU of content, like a book or a track on an album, or perhaps a film or some frames of a film. And so by having these very small models, they're super efficient in terms of training and building them, and super efficient in doing inference. The issue now is you're sort of trading. So a big model, like GPT, you're hoovering up the entirety of the world's information and trying to build this mega complicated model. And if you think about it, the way these models work is they create dimensionality that represents different facets of the data. The more varied the data, the more of these dimensions you have to build, the more vectors you have, it just scales up enormously, exponentially. When you build a small, and as a result, if you think about it, what is the output of a model at any given point in time? It's a single token.
Yeah.
It's generating a token or series of tokens that represent the completion output. Well, a small model also generates a token. So it'd be the equivalent of like having a large factory that you need to make a cup of coffee, or a simple coffee press to make a cup of coffee. The coffee press is probably more efficient than having a whole factory just to make that one cup.
Right.
But here we have these massive data factories to make a single morsel of data that's related to your AI stuff. Now, there's applications for it where you want to try to summarize and understand massive amounts of complexity.
Yeah, you're pulling the average of.
But the amount of computation is exponentially higher, like literally trillions or even quadrillions of times more than a simple model that only contains the data about a single book. Let's say it's a single, Lord of the Rings book.
Yeah,
or something.
I was reading about what that question mark, you don't need the question mark. It's an extra, it's the power of a lamp for 24 hours.
That's true.
If you add that question mark.
It's funny, I just got back from Europe, and the big question was how much water and how much energy is used, to generate a single result, and it's substantial. You're probably using it to do a single paragraph on GPT using this much water.
Yeah.
To cool the underlying GPUs.
And you see it, or is just based off to your point, making money, right? The business model right now is to
the problem is again, you're running this massive factory, which is with a large capital cost. First of all, the cost of the GPUs and data centers is gigantic. It's massive. And so you got that. You have the actual operational cost. You have the cost of power. You got the cost of, the cooling. All those things combined, it's extremely expensive. So if you think about these reasoning models, like O3 or something, it can cost thousands of dollars to generate a single answer. I don't think maybe there's some cases where it's worth paying $1,000, but most consumers wouldn't do that. I ran into albeit she's a very intelligent young woman who's a high school student. She said, I use ChatGPT all the time. Actually, I use the reasoning models because they're better at doing my homework or helping. And she said, I subscribe to the $200 a month, program at OpenAI. And we kind of walked through some of the use cases. And I said, here's a single essay that it wrote for you. That probably cost $10,000 to $20,000 worth of GPU time to generate that. You paid what? How much? How many essays do you do like that? I don't know. I do a dozen of those a month. And I'm paying $200. There's a disparity in terms of the underlying economics.
Right.
I don't think that's why the big model companies are building the big models. They're not building it with the idea that there's any present economics that justifies that. Otherwise, you wouldn't have OpenAI running at a loss of double-digit billions every year.
Right.
But the small models, they are cost-effective, and you can run them on very simple processors and so on. So I think ultimately, it's kind of like the world of traditional computing, where you had the mainframes, which were super expensive to run, super expensive to maintain, and they were useful for some certain business processes. But ultimately, everybody started using PCs to do various things, and they became an integral part of the business processes as well. And I think that's what's going to happen. And so we're on the forefront of building these small, easily utilizable, accountable, and auditable models. And those models act as helpers to the large models, offset some of their costs.
Is there a potential pathway where an end user, an individual, a consumer is your customer, or opting in, installing, and then a direct first-party contributor to a data set or a model that's...
Yeah, I think right now our focus has been mainly on the larger content companies because it's low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
But ultimately, is there a consumer thing? Yeah, I think every one of us generates important stuff. You're an expert at what you do. You're an expert at what you do. I'm presumably an expert at what I do. And so if we're able to use, digital twins of ourselves that can act as expansions of our own capabilities, that helps us participate more, more equitably in the emerging AI world. And so,
I was just thinking of even the cop story, right? He's got this in his pocket. That's great. I can think of 100 brands that would want to pay for, what coffee shop, what donut shop, whatever did he walk by, or when he felt stress, what radio station did he turn, or whatever it is, all of those connected dots, right?
That is what Meta and other companies have been selling to their advertisers, right? The concept of social media and search being as a way of providing information to people who are trying to merchandise to you. Obviously, that's been the mainstay. Yep. That is the funding that's been driving a lot of the current AI buildup too. It's money coming from traditional, advertising. To get a better understanding of an individual, basically their data exhaust, and using that to custom tailor things, I actually think a little differently. It's not going to be a company per se, it's going to be one agent kind of interacting with your agent and negotiating something that winds up being the best solution. Maybe there are multiple agents all offering the same ware. Maybe it's access to a cup of coffee, and this one's offering, better coffee, another one at a lower price, and they negotiate. And having an open market for that is fantastic. If you look at the economist Friedrich Hayek, he felt that the single biggest innovation of humanity was the idea of an open marketplace. The ability for us to be able to negotiate whatever it is, whether it's things or ideas, and we kind of believe that too. Personal digital space offers that marketplace.
Seems like this has the ability to make Tim his own marketplace, and then his agents can negotiate on directly, right? So it doesn't kind of cut out the middleman to a certain extent.
It really does.
Anyways.
Yeah. In fact, I mentioned the blockchain earlier. We use the blockchain in a kind of an unorthodox way. Most blockchains are being used as a sort of a statement of something that's happened. It's a ledger. We use our blockchain as an order book. You're basically putting in buys and sells. Think of it as a bunch of limit orders that exist on the blockchain, and are executed based on meeting certain conditions. So it really is, like I said, as an order book, not just simply a ledger, and that's very powerful. You don't need a third-party exchange. We're not a counterparty to a transaction. If you two are working, doing something together, we're just providing the means for it, but we're not a party to that, and therefore, you don't have to trust me,
right?
Because I have nothing to do with it.
But if it can be almost OEM, and it's a kernel or it's an app, or it's and it's embedded in our devices, and people are opting in. And then there is this idea of, it being sort of an unbiased, decentralized, governing body. It feels like there's sort of the potential to, you'd mentioned Meta and all these that are collecting all these data points. We know that much of the data still has its flaws. It's still probabilistic. So, can you be that holy grail filter to actually create some valid data?
Exactly. Well, you want some way to discern whether that data is in fact legitimate, and reputation indices are that. So marketplaces tend to be efficient about that. If you're scamming him, ultimately, you're scamming me, and somehow that'll come out, and your reputation will go down, and they won't work with you.
Right. Yeah.
So I think having, again, open information flow, transparency, auditability, accountability are all essential to building a healthy economic infrastructure. And maybe that's probably the way to think about this. What we're trying to do is build economic infrastructure for a healthy AI economy, because we don't think the way it's going right now is super healthy.
No, I would probably agree with that.
And,
No,
I was just going to say, yesterday we had a guest on who's in cybersecurity, and he was saying that one of the biggest challenges is people don't understand how valuable their data is and how they're not educated enough to protect their data. So I want to get your opinion on that and to see if you have any ideas or any, just tell people out there how valuable is your data and why it is valuable and how to get educated about it.
In some cases, your data is valuable in and of itself. More likely, your data is very important as it's aggregated with other people's data. So there's two different ways of looking at it. Having the ability to have you as a data point within a larger context of other data points provides an understanding of trends. It's fundamental to how decision making is done. Your data by itself, though, could be very, very important, not just to you, but also to people who provide you services, like healthcare data could be really, really important in rendering you a more efficient health regimen so that you are able to, cost less money to insurance companies, cost less money to, and have a better life. So there are two different ways of looking at it, but I think people disregard, we've been trained for 2 decades now to kind of give up everything about ourselves to social media because that gave us likes or gave us greatest social cred. And
it'll turn my face into a celebrity?
What was the thing that Altman said yesterday? He goes, people really do want to use Sora and, with their ability to put themselves into these videos because, by the way, that becomes property of OpenAI.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Right.
Yeah. So, great. You have a little gag,
do you really,
video.
Do you really think Google needs to know which of the cubes has a stoplight in it? We're teaching AI tools.
Well, that's true. Yeah. So using various captchas for sure. Right. You've been training image recognition systems. So anyway, going back to what you're saying. So I think your individual data is important. Certainly, it's important to you. And I think sometimes we as individuals have been trained to think, who cares? We're getting some service for it. But I think as you give it up, you kind of give up a piece of what makes you special, and especially if people companies start using that to target you in ways that really use up your time and use up your money. That's really a negative.
Infiltrate your privacy. It could be too.
Yeah, I mean, what's a single? I just saw this recently. I think I was reading. I think it might have been at Forbes or whatever, and they were saying that the single biggest distinction between people who are very wealthy and people who are less wealthy, other people who are really wealthy, even the celebrities are able to keep a certain measure of privacy because they're able to control it through various mechanisms. And so we do give up a lot of our privacy just on a day-to-day basis. Going to TSA and having your face scanned. All right, I don't do that, by the way.
No, but I guess some of the practicality of going to the airport and traveling, right? Or like, how can people that are, not in tune with the systems, maybe don't even understand some of the foundations of the technology, and it's either the polar, kind of mindset of they have everything already anyway, sure, blindly opt in and consent, versus the I'm not giving anything. How do we educate? How do we really either empower or bring everyone into the conversation to understand this?
I mean, it's amazing how much people are giving up for convenience. And in today's world where there's just so many things pulling at your time, that's a trade-off that people make every day. How do you educate people? You give them the tools that are easy to use. So ultimately, make it convenient for them to have some degree of sovereignty over their own personal data. I think we've been, like I said again, programmed in a sense to think that we shouldn't have any real control or sovereignty over our data. And my partner in personal digital space is Lori Fee now, who's obviously not here. That's her space. She's a privacy advocate. She ran the Electronic Frontier Foundation with that as a big cornerstone of their existence, was personal privacy, data privacy. And so that is also a very important part with our technology, is we allow you to have a measure of control, not just over the privacy, but also the commercialization of that data. So that, if you choose to give up certain amounts of information, you get compensated for it and you have some control of it. So, consent, control, and compensation are the 3 C's of what we do.
Because everyone just opts in. Sure, use my likeness for commercial purposes, or sell my data, or resell my data.
Well, or most of the time, it's not even a question of opting in. Most of the time, you have to opt out.
Yeah. Sort of the old adhesion contract, kind of just people just overlook it.
Yeah. Some apps won't even let you go onto their sites or whatever unless you just accept their contracts or whatever.
But it's convenience, like it said, right? It's like even the cookies banner and everything else. It's like most people just hit like whatever the biggest button is. It's allow, right? And and just get the banner off the screen. I don't care what
Yeah, people don't have time for that nonsense.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So we last week I was in Europe. I mentioned we were at The Hague, and they're talking about some of the European regulations, and a regulations to answer is another approach. I actually don't believe that works in the long run. Certainly, regulations can do what they need to do, but they also can really hinder economic development. They also can just hinder. People just don't like them. Like they get in the way. Yeah. And so in EU they have a Privacy Act, they have GDPR, they have the AI Act, and they have the Data Act. The Data Act is almost the opposite of the GDPR, because Data Act, basically, if you don't have a reason not to give up data, you have to give it up. That's basically, Data Act is sort of pro giving up data unless you have a good reason not to. GDPR is about protection, and the AI Act is all about how AI companies are going to be able to use this data and what how they're being regulated. We don't really have that kind of infrastructure, at least on a nationwide level. I don't see that happening anytime soon. I think by the time people feel like there's a need for it, that ship will have sailed.
Is it as politicized in the EU? It feels like, at least from the conversations that we've been a part of, when you talk about policy, it very quickly, and we kind of talked about this yesterday too, it very quickly turns to, if we allow technology and innovation, do you want your naked pictures of your daughter out on, versus if we regulate, then we're stifling all. It's like it's these polar spectrums, and like it's red and it's blue, and it's
Well, the problem with regulation is it never ever keeps remotely on pace with the technology. Mm-hmm. So let's say there was, the senator here, Senator Blumenthal, is part of a Senate subcommittee that was talking about different. I think actually there was a testimony probably a year and a half ago with Altman and others. Gary Marcus, I think, was one of the witnesses as well. They were testifying in front of Blumenthal and Hawley at the time, and their idea was to put together some policy. And Altman said, "Yeah, you should definitely do a policy." None of the stuff that they talked about even matters anymore. Like that was a year and a half ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how long does it take to get a policy through and write it?
I think we had Senator Maroney and Wong, in probably like 6 months after that, and I joked at the end. I was like, maybe we should have just given them both sock 'em boppers and let them go at it, right? Because it was what they were talking about was so far removed from what the actual needs were to be considered now, and it just turned into the. You could hear someone at the PTA meeting, right, in their town, like a local town, concerned about something, and that was what was becoming forefront of the conversation.
Our approach is to capture the legal, what are laws there for? Laws are there to govern how we all interact betwixt each other. And, the PDS approach is we do that on a transaction by transaction basis. Or it could do groupings as well, but it's done in the here and now. And so we find that contract law or licensing, which are done on a very individualized, circumstances, tend to be just as effective because ultimately those are enforceable using existing legal mechanisms, and you don't have to go out there and wait for legislators to catch up with it.
And do you think that putting regulations and guardrails on something limits innovation as well, in some cases?
I mean, people say that.
Yeah.
Sometimes actually spurs regulation. It spurs innovation because you have to figure out ways to be more innovative around whatever guardrails out there. I think that a lot of metaphors for that. If you didn't have guardrails on the roads, you'd be riding all over the road, and it wouldn't be as efficient. Yeah. So I think that regulations can definitely be a factor in how you construct your business, but that factor can also be a source for innovation, because by using a different approach than that would be limited by that particular regulation gives you a leg up.
That's interesting. That's an interesting thing.
We talked, sort of said, how did you end up in Connecticut? And you were talking about kind of expansion in Poland or Singapore and other areas of Europe and New York City. Is there anything current or an opportunity for Connecticut to come back as an attractive, or to be that attractive sort of foundational headquarters for you?
We are in Connecticut. Connecticut historically, this goes back to the Revolutionary War. We're the provision state, right? Mm-hmm. We're the state that provided all of the, all of the infrastructure for the Revolutionary War. I think Connecticut has an opportunity to do that. I think there's a really well-educated base of people here. I don't think the innovation mechanisms in Connecticut have been particularly helpful to us. So maybe we haven't really, pursued them that much. But they have a venture fund that just didn't make sense for us. Right. The CI people, although we did talk to them at one point. But I think in terms of attracting smart people, we're halfway between Boston, which has a great sense, and we have great schools here too. Obviously, we have Yale, we have UConn, we have others. So there, there definitely are. We don't have to relinquish everything to Silicon Valley or to San Francisco, even more so. I think that just happens to be, just happens to be a place that people go for that. But I think Connecticut could be a real powerhouse in this emerging information economy. I think Connecticut has historically played more into the healthcare space and into manufacturing too. Manufacturing, that has its own interesting aspects too. Mm-hmm. But I think in terms of us, we're not leaving or anything. We're not planning to do that. But I think as we're growing, we're trying to figure out, is it possible to grow within this the state, and mm-hmm. that's something we'll determine.
But I think, I think we're, because you'd sort of have to, you saw the sign, there was a new development, but you have a piece of property, in the mountains that is close to where you settled. So it wasn't necessarily driven by economic opportunity or the business climate. It was honestly, it's a lifestyle.
Well, look, when we set up our headquarters in, of all places, Winstead, it was equidistant from a drive time. We had a bunch of people who lived in Fairfield County, mm-hmm. and they would drive into New York City or take the train to get to New York City. In this case,
it's a nicer drive.
It's a nicer drive. Route 8 is pretty good.
Yeah.
So that wasn't a problem. So we were able to maintain our existing group of people. And honestly, the building kind of was cool. Mm-hmm. It reminded me of something that would be found in south of Market in San Francisco, or in Chelsea or Tribeca in New York. And so it had that kind of cool vibe to it. And I said, that's great. And here's the other thing that really made a difference for us: proximity to Bradley. Mm-hmm. Bradley is an easy airport. And that's probably one of the things that's really keeping us, because literally I can jump on a plane in Bradley and fly to Dublin and get to Europe really easily, much easier. It's faster for me to actually get to Dublin from Bradley than it is to drive and wait for the plane at JFK.
Yeah, I believe that.
So that's really a big, please, if Aer Lingus, keep them there. That's really helpful for our European stuff. And Bradley's an easy airport. Now, it's not a hub airport, which also makes it good. Which means that as a terminus airport, it's easy. I think it behooves the state to continue investing in a particular center, because that's very helpful. Mm-hmm. And for us, it's a 35-minute drive from our. I presume it's roughly about the same from here.
Yeah. What about in order for the state to really embrace this? Obviously, there's sort of a political philosophy or perspective that, whether it's hands-off or soft regulation or, enabling certain types. But, some of the other things that have been brought up, at least when it comes to technology and AI, is the cost of electricity, or, some of those other factors, at least with Connecticut.
We are good in that sense, because we don't demand we don't demand that massive data center investment. Now, we do use GPUs for training our models and so on, but we don't have to do it in these big, massive situations. Right now, I don't see the difference between getting a quantum of GPU, utilization running on a large data center versus running on a smaller system. It doesn't make a difference. They're about the same. You're not getting like there's no economy of scale. The only reason you're using large data centers is because you're dealing with such large models that the communication cost in between the various GPUs winds up being a factor. For us, we're building these small models. You know what really works well for us to communicate between models? Something called the internet. And that's pretty much widely available.
When you talk about smaller models or more, does that become more of a specialized use case?
It is a specialized use case.
Yeah.
I mean, these are specialist models. Whatever. I don't know if this is appropriate to even use this terminology nowadays, but essentially our models are idiot savants. We take smaller representations of large language models, and we strip out knowledge. We basically tell the model, you know nothing. It's sort of like reverse Dunning-Kruger. You know nothing about anything, and we then essentially fine-tune it or distill into it specific information. And so the big technological, I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's really the thing that distinguishes us technologically is the small models, the SAM, single asset models that are produced using our technology. They know what they don't know, and they tell you. They're honest. They say, I don't know. And most models never say that. They just basically come up with some answer because they're trained to give you an answer. Yeah. And that ability to say, I don't know, is huge because we're working on right now more on the collaboration part of it. I don't know, but maybe he knows. And so it actually refers you back. It's kind of almost like a self-referential internet where the models are the websites, and websites have specialized information. And if you don't see something on this website, you go to another website. In this case, the models kind of do that for you. And that's really, really powerful because now you're able to have not just one large model trying to think about everything, and not to anthropomorphize it too much, but to try to solve big problems. You have a bunch of small models, each with specialized knowledge that can solve a piece of the problem, and by collaborating, you are actually effectively, A, using up much less resources, and B, allowing the individuals that have built these models to gain some degree of reward for having those models. So
it seems like that's sort of where even Altman had kind of conceded or admitted or tipped the hand, right? That the current large scale models isn't necessarily sustainable. So a future of a reasoning layer that can then go and interact with these agents or small specialized models to ultimately.
We don't have to do anything to be compatible. There are existing protocols, something called MCP, Model Context Protocol, that allows the large models to discover smaller models and interact with them. That exists. So it's not like we have to go out there and sign a deal with OpenAI or sign a deal with Google. They just discover the models. We put them as endpoints on people's websites. There's an emerging standard called RSL, which is a licensing protocol that's built into robots.txt. We're the first implementer of that. And so if they find an interesting piece of information, they could scrape the robots.txt file. Oh, okay, we'll agree to that license, and they have access to information. And the big difference from grabbing the website data and scraping it versus using a SAM is the SAM acts almost like a barrier. It acts almost like think of it, a SAM almost like the way you'd have an attorney acting on your behalf. It's an intermediary that will provide the answers that you want to give in a contained way without giving up all of the core information. And that's really important because that way you're not surrendering your underlying data.
And indirectly or directly, it also seems like that then solves many of the questions around, to your point, it prevents it from hallucinating because it'll tell you when it's hit its limit. But what it does return, it can be cited, and that's where there's
and you have a
real
full audit
authority
trail.
built.
And because there's small models attached to licenses and attached to a commercial transaction, you have all the payment information, you have all the information, and it all works out well in today's kind of decentralized economy.
So how do you stay focused? Because you have such a depth and breadth and understanding of the connectivity of the systems, the capabilities of the technology. And how are you staying focused on personal digital spaces or on a vision when it seems like there's so many factors that could sort of, well, what if we did this, or what if we did this, or what about these opportunities?
I mean, I think I do have an academic side, so I do get a chance to look at bigger sort of academic questions as well, although they're not always so big. Sometimes they're very contained too. But in terms of personal digital spaces, I think we are a very horizontal platform. We are potentially a game changer. We recently were talking to a banker, and he said, "You guys really are the commerce infrastructure for the emerging AI internet or the AI economy." Mm-hmm. And so it does give me the ability to do lots of things in different spaces. Do we have the resources to do that? We're focusing on very specific customers, and ultimately, when you're a business, focusing on customers and getting paid for doing that results in good things. Where we've been either a break even or for a tech company, we've been self-funded. We've taken no institutional capital, and we have been profitable. So that's not typical of most AI companies.
Not at all. No.
Yeah.
What keeps you motivated? What keeps you going and wanting to achieve, that kind of goal?
That's a good question. So, why am I doing this? I'm not a young person by any stretch, but the vision is if we don't do it, who will? And the thing that motivates me is I really do believe that we're at a point in time right now that decisions are being made. There's an adage, architecture is policy. And if the architectures are decided on in such a way that they're not, made for human, we have I think our website has a motto. In fact, we own the website, technology made for humankind. If we allow us to be subjugated to technology versus technology acting as a tool and enhancer of us, then, game over at some level. Mm-hmm. To me, that's more frightening than any of the apocalyptic kind of scenarios that have been presented by the various doomsdayers about AI, is that we've given up something that allows us to maintain equal first class positioning within the emerging world, and that's what motivates me. It's less about I don't really need to make. I want to make money, but it's not like we need to do this. The drive here is that this is something that if we do this right, it will set a tone. And I'm not looking to do this by myself. We're looking to do this in a collaborative way. We're open sourcing, we're working with different organizations. We're trying to set this up as policy. We're really trying to convince people that you don't have to invest billions, if not trillions of dollars into large data centers, building single purpose, large, massive models. You can actually spread this out and make it more democratic.
Has that been the bigger challenge, is sort of reaching enough folks to convey the vision, or are there skeptics or is there pushback on?
Honestly, we have been pretty stealthy thus far. For a company as old as ours, there's not much out there about us. We've been doing this through partnerships with customers and with others. I think this is a time to start really, putting the pedal to the metal and being much more vocal about it, and that's the process we're starting. And this actual podcast is one element of that.
What's the so we'll kind of build on that. So then, what's the elevator pitch? If you could get in front of everyone that's going to be at the event and kind of give them this is why we're on the map, and you should be considering personal digital spaces. What's that universal kind of conveyance of value that a CEO that still has a flip phone and
what's the pitch to a customer or to in general? But to customer, it's all about what I said earlier, consent. Yeah. It's consent, control, and compensation. If you're a media company and you've let's say you're a 100-year-old media company and you've spent 100 years building your brand, building your collection, your library of assets, why would you want to A, give it up deliberately, or B, accidentally because you haven't taken action and it's now been co-opted by other people. Yeah. Once you lose it, can't get it back. Mm-hmm. So maintain your control, make sure you have mechanisms for consent and auditability, and ultimately get paid for it. One of the biggest pitches we do to a lot of the publishers and others is, don't wait for someone else to do your AI transformation. Do it yourself and do it in an economic way so you can afford it. And so, one of our customers is a large multi-billion-dollar book publisher, and the CEO. In fact, I'm having lunch with the CEO next week, and he said, we're a 200-plus-year-old company. We used to print Bibles and books. We're basically a print shop, and ultimately we became a distribution for those books. That's what publishers do. And 20 so years ago, we moved into electronic formats, EPUB, for Kindle and so on. And now we want to be using AI as our distribution fabric. So we're going from print to EPUBs to AI. And you guys are facilitating. You're the print shop for us being an AI company. And that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. You can think about that for any asset that has intellectual property value. Use AI as a way of distributing. Here's another interesting use case, non-orthodox use case, but if you're in a world of patents, okay, so let's say you have a patent for something, a better version of this bottle, you have a patent for it. You can go out, you can raise money, build a factory, manufacture these bottles, or license this patent. What if you provide an AI model that explains how to do this and get paid for doing that and allow other people to create better bottles, but even open source it and create even better technology on top of yours and just create a better world. But you get your piece of it, you get your royalties. That's kind of cool. Or if you have a character, what if that character is not used in a conventional way? Bilbo Baggins is not being used just simply as a character in a Hobbit, but he becomes part of the Marvel universe or something like that. How do you do that? How do you license it? How do you handle those relationships? Right now it's difficult, lots of lawyers, just make it easy. And all of a sudden you find that your assets have much more value in different use cases and become much more bespoke and interesting.
Because that's where I was trying to get the clarification, at least from was the IP protection and monetization.
You got to fence in your land before you can actually make money off your land. But then ultimately, don't create just a gate that no one can get in, but create a turnstile. They have to put a token in and get in and use whatever you have.
It's an interesting way to look at it. I know Gary Vee always talks about IP and how important it is, and how that's the future.
This country's built on IP. I mean, we were arguably one of the first countries that really formalized patents and copyrights. Our founding fathers realized that. And we've been able to do things with that IP, but sometimes it's very difficult. It's IP, cost of capital, right? Because you need capital to do something with IP, and ultimately a consumer market that's going to benefit from whatever you're doing. That's the manufacturing world. But in a world of information manufacturing, where you start dealing with all kinds of, going back to book publishing, fan fiction. There's really cool fan fiction out there, but right now, the author doesn't get anything for it, other than perhaps some, publicity. What if there's a way where everybody participates and wins? And so we're trying to provide that system, that ecosystem, that economic ecosystem for that payment. We do the payments, we do the licensing, we do all of the security for the underlying IP as well.
Well, I guess what would be your one piece of advice for the 22-year-old technologist that's trying to come up with and identify what could be a foundational piece of tech for the future?
There's a technology writer and pundit who used to use this as the byline on all her emails. Always make new mistakes. So don't be afraid. Just embrace it. I have a 22-year-old by happenstance, 22-year-old son, and he actually has a degree in cognitive neuroscience. I'm saying, that's interesting. He's thinking about going for a PhD. I'm like, no. Try everything you can. Experiment. This is and even Altman says this too. He goes, I think there was an interview with him recently with Sam Altman where he said that, he of course dropped out of school to do his company. It's like, he envies the college dropout because there's a time where you don't need to go through formal processes. In fact, those are limiting because things are moving so fast. So if you're a 22-year-old entrepreneur, test all the different possibilities. Don't be afraid, and don't wait for the capital to show up. Do it on your own. I'm not a big fan of necessarily waiting for someone to write me a check before I do something. I'll just go out and do it. I'll find a way. And so just don't be restrained by conventional, structures. Just go out there, experiment, and try. And the world of AI, even with today's LLMs, notwithstanding what PDS is doing, give you the ability to try a lot of interesting experiments. You'll get hallucinations sometimes that you can learn from as well. And I would say that there's a lot of opportunity. I think, for someone who is ambitious and wants to go out there and do something, that's the world is great. For a lot of other people who are just feeling left behind, what can I say? I think just look at the world around you from a bigger perspective. Don't look at it from, I don't have as much of a social presence as someone else. Try to get out there and do as much as you can.
Is there anything that you've sort of seen recently where you said, I wish I thought that, or that was genius, or it seems like you've been on the forefront of all of these innovations that maybe you can't be impressed. So I'm just curious what has launched, or has you've sort of seen and thought, wow, that's really cool. That's
like really recently or in general?
I mean, if nothing really recent jumps to mind, then in general. But
no, I mean, I think the level of progress going on is extraordinary, and certainly in the AI space, and it's driving progress in other places too. I think they're more advanced. This is. I have to be careful about who the audience is, but I'm actually very impressed about things that I'm seeing coming out of China now. Notwithstanding our political situation and our national identity versus theirs, but a lot of smart people. It's a very technocratic kind of country. Some of the things that I'm seeing with companies like DeepSeek are very innovative, in a sense that they are limited in what they have. And I think the limitations, to the point you made earlier, sometimes the limitations are the things that, whether it's regulatory or whether it's just simply not having access to certain resources, has resulted in some remarkable ways of thinking. And I think sometimes we have it too good, and we don't look at what the alternatives are. I think recently I've seen one iteration after another of interesting approaches to reasoning, to training, and so on by some of the Chinese companies. What they're doing that I think is really great is they're open sourcing everything. And so it's not limited to just them and the companies themselves. It allows other groups. And so I'm seeing pockets of interesting work coming out of parts of Africa that you never would have imagined. Interesting things come. There's a company in Finland, Silo AI, that had the limitation that they did not have access to NVIDIA hardware the way other places do, and so they built a whole stack that runs an AMD. Well, you've seen where AMD's stock price has been going. I would attribute a lot of AMD's current success. I think they've grown by 40% in stock value in a matter of days, is attributable to Silo AI building a whole AI stack on top of AMD chips.
Wow.
Because they didn't have access to NVIDIA.
I've been seeing news about that. That is incredible.
do you think that we're lapped already and we don't want to admit it?
No, I don't think we're lapped. I think that if we sort of give up, we'll be lapped. But I don't think this country gives up. I've never seen that. Have you?
No. It's just, and that's why sometimes I wonder whether we're too close to seeing all of these things, and and it feels like we are getting lapped, where you see all these other these innovations, and it doesn't feel as though there's as much of an internal focus, whether it's
I think
at the top or down the street, that is really focusing on innovation. And
I mean, what's interesting about the large companies, the OpenAIs of the world, Anthropics of the world, and others, is they're finding a way. What's remarkable about this country is that capital is available, like all the time. Even in situations where you would say, well, shouldn't be, it is. And some of the innovations, going back to the other earlier question, that I think some of the so-called round tripping that's being done right now is kind of remarkably interesting. I'll give you an example. XAI is doing a financing round where they are getting an SPV to acquire a bunch of NVIDIA assets. That SPV is doing this through a combination of equity and debt. We don't know what the exact detail, what the exact mix is, but they're able to essentially acquire NVIDIA stuff with the idea that XAI is signing long-term leases for those hardware. So XAI doesn't carry the debt on their balance sheet.
It was a nice way around those regulations that.
Yeah. And meanwhile, this SPV carries the risk, but the risk is kind of diminished because XAI has signed a long-term contract. It's almost like some of the rules we learned from real estate financing, creative financial engineering, and it's helping propel these large build-outs. Now, I sound negative about them. I think those large build-outs are also intriguing because when you have that much computational capability, remarkable things will happen. I think the transformer-based LLMs that have been the mainstay for the last 5 years or so, they're being slowly eclipsed and improved upon. There's a company called AI21 out of Israel that's using Mamba, which is a different approach. It's a selective state machine, and that approach is different than transformers, but also requires a lot of computational stuff. And so you'll see these new models being experimented on because there is so much data center capabilities that are being built up, and yet we're funding it. It's kind of propping up our economy. Maybe there's a bubble, but bubbles usually happen because there's sort of a timing issue, and there might be a little bit of a deflation somewhere. Who knows? But I think cool things are going to come out of it that are going to be ultimately very helpful all the way around.
I love it. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate it.